The freezing wind howled through the narrow streets of Hecla, Montana, carrying with it the promise of death for anyone caught outside without shelter on this bitter January night in 1884. And Rosa Kensington pressed her palms against the locked door of her uncle's house, her breath coming in desperate gasps as ice crystals formed on her eyelashes, and her fingers began to lose all feeling. She had been out gathering firewood from the shed behind the property when she heard the bolt slide into place, followed by her cousin Margaret's cruel laughter echoing through the wooden planks. The betrayal cut deeper than the wind that sliced through her thin cotton dress and worn shawl. Rosa had come to live with her uncle's family 6 months ago after her parents died of influenza back in Ohio. And from the first day, Margaret had made it clear that she resented sharing her home with a poor relation. But this was beyond jealousy or spite. This was murder, plain and simple, because no one survived a Montana winter night exposed to the elements like this. "Please," Rosa called out, pounding on the door with fists that barely felt like her own anymore. "Margaret, let me in. I am begging you." She heard footsteps inside, and for a moment hope flared in her chest, but then Margaret's voice came through the door, cold and satisfied. "Father said you have been eating too much and contributing too little. He said we would be better off without another mouth to feed. I am just helping him make the hard decision he has been too soft to make himself." "Your father would never condone this," Rosa protested, though even as she spoke the words, doubt crept into her mind. Uncle Howard had grown increasingly resentful of her presence, especially after the mining company reduced his wages. Every meal she ate, every candle burned while she mended clothes in the evening, had become a silent accusation in his eyes. "Father is passed out drunk in his chair, and Mother took my side when I told her you tried to steal her brooch," Margaret said with audible satisfaction. "By morning, you will just be another unfortunate soul who wandered out into the cold and lost her way. These things happen all the time in Montana." The footsteps retreated, and Rosa was left alone with the wind and the darkness and the creeping cold that had already spread from her extremities into her core. She tried the door again, throwing her shoulder against it, but it held firm. The windows were all shuttered from the inside, and she knew from experience that they latched securely. She stumbled away from the house, her legs already growing stiff, and looked desperately up and down the street for any sign of life, any light in a window, any hope of salvation. Hecla was a small mining town, home to perhaps 200 souls, and most of them turned in early to conserve lamp oil and firewood. The few saloons and the general store would be closed at this hour, and the wind was so fierce that her cries for help were snatched away before they could travel more than a few feet. Rosa wrapped her arms around herself and tried to think through the fog that was beginning to cloud her mind. She needed shelter. The livery stable was 3 blocks away. If she could make it there, she could burrow into the hay and possibly survive until morning. She forced her legs to move, each step an act of will as the wind tried to push her back. The cold had moved beyond pain into a strange numbness that was almost peaceful, and some distant part of her mind recognized that as a very bad sign. She had heard stories of people freezing to death, how they got confused and tired and just wanted to lie down and sleep. She could not let that happen. She would not give Margaret the satisfaction. The street seemed to stretch on forever, and halfway to the livery, Rosa stumbled and fell to her knees in the snow. The impact barely registered. She tried to stand, but her legs would not cooperate, and the seductive urge to simply curl up and rest grew stronger. She was so tired, and the cold did not hurt anymore. Maybe if she just closed her eyes for a moment, she could gather her strength. The sound of hoofbeats cut through the wind, and Rosa lifted her head with enormous effort. Through the swirling snow, she could make out the shape of a horse and rider approaching from the far end of town. She tried to call out, but her voice emerged as barely a whisper. The rider would pass right by her, another dark shape in the storm, and she would die here in the street like an unwanted dog. But the rider slowed as he drew closer, and then stopped altogether. Rosa heard the creak of leather as he dismounted, and then strong hands were gripping her shoulders, and a deep voice was speaking urgent words she could not quite comprehend through the ringing in her ears. "Miss, can you hear me? Miss, you have got to stay awake." Rosa forced her eyes to focus on the face above her. Even in the darkness and the storm, she could make out strong features, a thick beard dusted with ice, and eyes that held genuine concern. He was young, perhaps mid-20s, and he wore the typical garb of a working cowboy with a heavy sheepskin coat and a hat tied down with a scarf against the wind. "So cold," she managed to whisper. "I know, I can see that. What are you doing out here? Where do you live?" Rosa turned her head toward her uncle's house, and something in her expression must have told the story, because the cowboy's jaw tightened. He looked from her to the shuttered house and back again, and she saw understanding dawn in his eyes. "They locked you out," he said, and it was not a question. She nodded, and that small movement seemed to take the last of her energy. Her eyes started to drift closed, but he shook her gently. "No, you stay with me. What is your name?" "Rosa," she breathed. "Rosa, I am Marcus. Marcus Thorne. I am going to get you somewhere warm, all right." She wanted to tell him about the livery stable, about how she had been trying to reach it, but the words would not come. Marcus stood, lifting her with an ease that suggested considerable strength, and carried her toward the house she had been locked out of. Rosa tried to protest, to tell him that there was no help to be found there, but he was already climbing the steps to the porch. "Open this door," Marcus shouted, his voice cutting through the wind like a knife. There was no response from inside. Marcus shifted Rosa in his arms, supporting her weight against his chest, and pounded on the door with his free hand hard enough to rattle the frame. "I said open this door. There is a woman out here freezing to death. Still nothing." Rosa could picture Margaret inside, that satisfied smile on her face, waiting for nature to do her murderous work. Marcus pounded again, harder this time, and Rosa heard something crack in the wood. "Last chance," Marcus called out. "Open up or I am coming through." The silence from inside was answer enough. Marcus backed up, adjusted his hold on Rosa, and then drove his shoulder into the door with all the force of his considerable size behind it. The wood shrieked in protest, but held. He backed up and hit it again, and this time the frame splintered around the lock. One more impact and the door burst inward, the lock mechanism tearing free from the wood in a shower of splinters. Margaret screamed from somewhere in the house, and Rosa heard her Aunt Dorothy shouting in alarm. Marcus strode inside without hesitation, tracking snow across the floor, and looked around the modest home with its single main room, fireplace, and sleeping areas curtained off in the corners. What is the meaning of this? Aunt Dorothy emerged from behind one of the curtains, her face flushed with outrage. "You have broken into our home." "I found your niece dying in the street," Marcus said, his voice dangerously quiet. "She was locked out of the house in the middle of a winter storm." "That is attempted murder where I come from. I do not know what lies she told you, but I did not get the story from her. I got it from the evidence. She was collapsed in the snow, frozen half to death, wearing nothing but a house dress. She was outside that door when I arrived, and that door was locked and barred from the inside. So you can spare me whatever tale you have prepared, because I am not interested in hearing it." Margaret appeared from behind another curtain, her face pale. "She tried to steal from us." "We were just—" "Be quiet, Margaret." her mother hissed. Marcus carried Rosa toward the fireplace, where a modest fire burned in the grate. He set her down in a chair near the warmth and began chafing her hands between his own, trying to restore circulation. Rosa whimpered at the pain that came with returning sensation, and Marcus gentled his touch but did not stop. "We need blankets and hot water," he said without looking at the two women. "Now, you cannot just come in here and give orders," Aunt Dorothy sputtered. Marcus turned his head and fixed her with a look that made her take a step back. "Your niece is suffering from severe exposure. If she does not get warmed up properly, she could lose her fingers and toes to frostbite, if not her life. So, unless you want to explain to the territorial marshal how she came to be in this condition, I suggest you cooperate." The mention of the marshal seemed to break through Aunt Dorothy's outrage. She hurried to gather blankets, and Margaret, after a moment's hesitation, put a kettle on the hook over the fire. Marcus pulled off his own coat and wrapped it around Rosa's shoulders, adding its warmth to the fire's heat. He continued working on her hands and feet, his movements practiced and efficient. "Have you done this before?" Rosa asked through chattering teeth. "Lost a good friend to exposure during a blizzard up in Wyoming," Marcus said quietly. "Found him too late. Swore I would never let that happen again if I could help it." Aunt Dorothy returned with several quilts, which Marcus arranged around Rosa, tucking them carefully to trap the heat. The kettle began to steam, and he poured some of the hot water into a cup, testing the temperature carefully before holding it to Rosa's lips. "Small sips," he instructed. "We need to warm you from the inside, too." The hot water burned going down, but it was a good kind of pain, a sign that her body was still capable of feeling. Rosa took several small sips and then leaned back against the chair, exhausted from even that small effort. Marcus set the cup aside and checked her fingers and toes, examining them closely in the firelight. "I think we got to you in time," he said. "Some mild frostbite, but if we are lucky, no permanent damage." "Thank you," Rosa whispered. "You saved my life. Anyone would have done the same." "No," she said, meeting his eyes. "They would not have. You broke down a door for a stranger. That is something more." A crash from across the room interrupted them. Uncle Howard had emerged from his drunken stupor and knocked over a chair in his confusion. He stared at the broken door, at Marcus and Rosa by the fire, and at his wife and daughter standing guilty and afraid by the table. "What in the hell is going on here?" he demanded. Marcus stood, and Rosa noticed for the first time how tall he was, easily over 6 feet, with the kind of broad-shouldered build that came from years of hard physical labor. "Your daughter locked your niece out in the storm. I found her nearly frozen to death in the street." Uncle Howard's bleary eyes focused on Rosa, and for a moment she saw something that might have been shame flicker across his face. Then his expression hardened. "This is a family matter. You have no business interfering. The second you left a woman to die in the cold, it stopped being a family matter and became a matter for the law," Marcus said. "Now, I can ride to the marshal's office and bring him back here to hear the whole story, or we can come to an arrangement." "What kind of arrangement?" Uncle Howard asked suspiciously. "Rosa comes with me. You do not try to stop her, and you do not make any claims on her in the future. In exchange, I do not report what happened here tonight." "You cannot take her," Aunt Dorothy protested. "It would be scandalous. She is an unmarried woman." "As opposed to the scandal of attempting to murder her," Marcus shot back. "I think she will take her chances with gossip over death by freezing." Rosa found her voice, though it still came out weak and raspy. "I want to go with him." Uncle Howard looked at her for a long moment, and she could see the calculation in his eyes. Having her gone solved his problem of feeding another mouth, and avoiding the marshal's attention was worth a great deal. Finally, he nodded. "Take her then." She has been nothing but trouble since she arrived. I will need to collect my things, Rosa said, trying to stand. Her legs buckled immediately and Marcus caught her before she could fall. Tell me where they are and I will get them, he said. The small trunk in the corner. That is everything I own. Marcus retrieved the worn leather trunk, which could not have weighed more than 30 pounds. Everything Rosa had brought from her old life in Ohio fit into a container small enough for one man to carry easily. He tucked it under one arm and then scooped Rosa up again with the other, blankets and all. I should make you pay for that door, Uncle Howard said, but his voice lacked conviction. Consider it the price of my silence, Marcus replied. He carried Rosa out into the night, where his horse waited patiently, snow gathering on its mane. The animal was a sturdy bay gelding with intelligent eyes and the heavy build of a working ranch horse. Marcus secured Rosa's trunk to the saddle, then lifted her up and settled her in front of the saddle horn before mounting behind her. He wrapped his coat more securely around both of them and gathered the reins. "Where are we going?" Rosa asked, the exhaustion making her words slur slightly. "My place is about 3 miles outside of town. I've got a cabin there, small but warm. You will be safe." Rosa knew she should probably question the wisdom of going off with a stranger into the night, but she was too tired and too grateful to care. Marcus had saved her life when her own family had tried to end it. Whatever happened next had to be better than what she was leaving behind. She leaned back against his solid chest and let the rhythm of the horse's gait lull her into a half-doze as they left Hecla behind. The ride was a misery of cold and discomfort, but Marcus kept one arm wrapped securely around her waist, holding her steady, and she focused on that contact as an anchor to consciousness. She must have drifted off despite her best efforts, because the next thing she knew, Marcus was lifting her down from the horse in front of a small log cabin. Lamplight glowed in the single window, and smoke rose from the chimney. "I left a fire banked this morning," Marcus explained, pushing open the door. "Should still have some heat." The interior of the cabin was indeed blessedly warm compared to the brutal cold outside. It was a single room, perhaps 20 feet on a side, with a stone fireplace at one end, a bed in one corner, a small table with 2 chairs, some shelving with supplies, and a few pegs on the wall for hanging clothes. It was spare but clean, and after months of living under her aunt and uncle's roof where her presence had been rescented, it felt like a palace. Marcus set Rosa down in the room's only upholstered chair, a well-worn piece positioned near the fireplace, and set about building up the fire. Within minutes, fresh flames were crackling cheerfully, pushing back the cold. He filled a pot with snow from outside and set it to melt and heat, then rummaged in his supplies for what looked like a tin of tea. "I am not much of a host," he said with a self-deprecating smile. "I have tea and coffee and some stew left from dinner. Not fancy, but it is hot and filling." "It sounds perfect," Rosa said sincerely. Marcus heated the stew and served it in a simple bowl with a chunk of bread. Rosa's hands were still shaky, but she managed to feed herself, and the food was better than anything she had tasted in months. Her aunt had never been much of a cook, and Rosa's contributions to the kitchen had been met with constant criticism. This simple venison stew, rich with root vegetables and seasoned with just salt and pepper, tasted like heaven. As she ate, she studied her rescuer in the better light of the cabin. Marcus was probably about 26 or 27, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and warm brown eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled. His face was honest and open, weathered by sun and wind but not hardened by it. There was a gentleness in the way he moved, a consideration that suggested he was used to handling things that required a soft touch. "You said your cabin is 3 miles from town," Rosa said when she had finished eating. "What brings you out this way?" "I work for the Double T Ranch," Marcus explained, settling into the other chair with his own bowl of stew. "The owner, Tom Thorne, is my uncle. He gave me this piece of land and helped me build the cabin when I came out here 3 years ago from Kansas. I handle the horses mostly, breaking and training them. The cabin is close enough to the main ranch to be convenient but far enough out that I've got some privacy." "Thorne," Rosa repeated. "So the double T stands for Tom Thorne, yes. Not the most creative name for a ranch, but it works." Rosa smiled, the first genuine smile she had managed in longer than she could remember. "It is straightforward. I appreciate that." They fell into a comfortable silence as they finished their meals. Marcus made the promised tea, and Rosa wrapped her hands around the warm cup, savoring the heat and the simple comfort of being inside and safe. Eventually, though, practical concerns had to be addressed. "I should probably figure out where I am sleeping," Rosa said hesitantly. "I do not want to impose more than I already have." "You are taking the bed," Marcus said firmly. "I have slept in the stable and in bedrolls on the ground more times than I can count. The floor with a few blankets will suit me fine." "I cannot take your bed. This is your home. And you are my guest who nearly died tonight. You are taking the bed, and that is final." There was no anger in his tone, just a calm certainty that brooked no argument. Rosa found herself nodding in agreement, too tired to fight even if she had wanted to. Marcus helped her to the bed, which was made up with rough but clean linens and several thick quilts. She sank into it with a sigh of relief, and Marcus tucked the blankets around her with the same care he had shown when warming her by her uncle's fire. "Thank you," Rosa said, looking up at him. "For everything. I do not know how I can ever repay you." "No repayment needed. Just rest and get your strength back." He turned down the lamp to a low glow and settled on the floor near the fireplace with his bedroll and blankets. Rosa watched him for a moment, this stranger who had risked himself for her without hesitation, and felt something shift in her chest. It was too early to put a name to the feeling, too soon after the trauma of the evening, but it was there nonetheless, a small seed of warmth taking root. She closed her eyes and let sleep claim her, and for the first time since her parents had died, she felt safe. Rosa woke to daylight streaming through the cabin's window and the smell of coffee and frying bacon. For a moment, she was disoriented, unable to place where she was or why the ceiling above her was rough-hewn logs instead of the painted boards of her aunt's house. Then memory returned in a rush, and she sat up with a gasp. "Easy there," Marcus said from where he stood at the fireplace, tending a pan on a grate over the flames. "You are safe. Everything is all right." Rosa took a shaky breath and looked down at her hands. They were slightly swollen and sore, and there were some patches of red skin that would probably turn darker before they healed, but all her fingers were intact. She wiggled her toes experimentally and felt the same soreness but no sharp pain. Marcus had been right. She would recover. "How are you feeling?" Marcus asked, bringing over a cup of coffee, sore, stiff. "Grateful to be alive," Rosa said, accepting the cup. "What time is it?" "About 9 in the morning. I let you sleep in. Figured you needed the rest after last night." Rosa sipped the coffee and watched as Marcus finished preparing breakfast. He moved around the small cabin with easy familiarity, clearly comfortable in his own space. He had changed into fresh clothes, and his hair was still slightly damp, suggesting he had washed at some point after waking. Rosa felt distinctly grimy by comparison and wished for a bath and clean clothes. As if reading her thoughts, Marcus said, "I've got a tub in the storage shed outside. I can heat water for a bath if you would like. It will take a while, but I have got nowhere pressing to be today." I do not want to be a burden." "You are not a burden. You are a guest, and not even by your own choice. Let me do this." Rosa agreed, and after a breakfast of bacon, eggs, and biscuits that were only slightly burnt, Marcus set about the considerable task of heating enough water for a bath. He had to make multiple trips to the well behind the cabin, and the heating process took the better part of 2 hours, but he never complained. When the tub was finally ready, he carried it inside, set it near the fireplace where the water would stay warm longest, and then excused himself to check on his horse and give Rosa privacy. The bath was heaven. Rosa scrubbed away the grime and fear of the previous night, soaking in the warmth until her skin pruned and the water began to cool. She washed her hair with the sliver of soap Marcus had left for her, and then dried off with a rough towel. Her dress from the previous night was ruined, stiff with ice and dirt, but her trunk held 2 other dresses and a few changes of underthings. She put on the better of the 2 dresses, a simple blue calico that had been her mother's, and braided her damp hair. When Marcus returned, summoned by her call, he stopped in the doorway and stared for a moment before catching himself. Rosa felt heat rise in her cheeks at the look in his eyes. "I am sorry," he said quickly. "I did not mean to be rude. It is just that you looked so miserable last night, and now you look like a completely different person." "I certainly feel like a different person," Rosa said. "Thank you again for the bath. I know it was a lot of work. It was worth it to see you smile." The words hung in the air between them, charged with a meaning that went beyond simple kindness. Rosa looked away first, unsure how to navigate this strange new territory. She had only known this man for less than a day, but he had already done more for her than her own family had in 6 months. It created a bond, but what kind of bond she was not yet sure. Marcus cleared his throat and began dumping the bathwater outside, bucket by bucket, breaking the moment. When the tub was empty, he stowed it back in the shed and returned to find Rosa standing by the window, looking out at the snowy landscape. "We should probably talk about what happens next," Marcus said gently. "I know. I cannot stay here indefinitely. It would not be proper, and I need to find work, some way to support myself." "There are not a lot of options for women in Hecla," Marcus said carefully. "The saloons are always looking for girls, but I would not recommend that path. There is the general store, but old Mrs. Patterson who runs it has never hired help. Some of the miners' wives take in laundry or sewing, but that barely pays enough to keep body and soul together." "So what are you suggesting?" Marcus took a deep breath. "I am suggesting that you stay here with me. I know how it sounds, but hear me out. You can keep house, cook, mend clothes, all the things I am terrible at. In exchange, you get room and board and safety. We would be business partners, nothing improper. People would talk. People are going to talk no matter what you do. At least this way you have got a roof over your head and food in your belly while they are doing it." Rosa considered his proposal. It was unorthodox, certainly, and would likely damage her reputation, but what reputation did she have to protect? She was an orphan who had been cast out by her only living relatives. If she tried to make it on her own in Hecla, she would be fighting an uphill battle against poverty and prejudice, and there was no guarantee she would succeed. At least here, with Marcus, she had a chance at something better. "All right," she said finally. "I accept your offer, but I want to be clear that I will earn my keep. I will not be a charity case. I would not expect anything less." They shook hands on the agreement, and Rosa felt that seed of warmth in her chest grow a little bit stronger. She was not naive enough to think that this arrangement would be without complications, but for the first time since her parents had died, she felt a glimmer of hope for the future. The next few weeks fell into a comfortable routine. Rosa took over the cooking and housekeeping duties, which had clearly been neglected during Marcus's bachelor existence. She scrubbed the cabin from top to bottom, organized the supplies, and mended a truly impressive pile of clothes that Marcus had been ignoring. She also proved to be a far better cook than he was, and Marcus's appreciative comments on her meals became a regular feature of their dinners. For his part, Marcus was careful to maintain propriety. He continued to sleep on the floor, though Rosa had tried multiple times to convince him to at least take the bed on alternate nights. He was courteous and respectful, always asking permission before entering if she was in the cabin during the day, and making sure she had privacy when she needed it. But despite these careful boundaries, there was a growing ease between them, a friendship developing that felt both natural and inevitable. Rosa learned that Marcus had come to Montana after a falling out with his father back in Kansas. His father had wanted him to take over the family's dry goods store, but Marcus had always been drawn to working with animals rather than merchandise. When his father had issued an ultimatum, Marcus had chosen freedom over family expectations and headed west to join his uncle's ranch. He spoke of the decision with some regret, but no real doubt that it had been the right choice. "I think I would have withered away behind a store counter," he told Rosa one evening as they sat by the fire after dinner. "I need space and air and honest work with my hands." My father could not understand that. To him, the store represented security and respectability, and anything else was foolishness. "My parents would have understood," Rosa said softly. "They were not wealthy, but they valued happiness over status. My father was a printer, and he loved his work. He would come home with ink on his hands and stories about the latest newspaper articles he had set type for. My mother was a seamstress, and she could make the plainest fabric look beautiful. They worked hard, but they were happy. What happened to them? Influenza, last year. It swept through our town and took so many people. They died within days of each other." Rosa's voice caught, and she had to pause to compose herself. "I tried to keep the house and my mother's sewing business going, but I could not manage it alone. The creditors came, and I lost everything. My uncle was my only living relative, so I wrote to him, and he agreed to take me in. I thought I was lucky. I thought it was a fresh start." Marcus reached over and took her hand, and Rosa held on tightly, grateful for the comfort. "I am sorry you lost them. And I am sorry your uncle turned out to be such a miserable excuse for a human being. Margaret was the real villain. I think my uncle would have tolerated me if she had not poisoned my aunt against me. She saw me as competition somehow, even though I did not want anything from them except a chance to work and earn my place. Well, you have got that chance here, and I promise you, I do not see you as competition or a burden or anything except exactly what you are." "And what is that?" Rosa asked, looking up at him. "Someone brave and strong who deserves better than what life has handed her so far." The sincerity in his voice made Rosa's heart skip. She was falling for him, she realized. It had been happening gradually over the past few weeks, in 100 small moments of kindness and consideration. The way he always served her first at meals. The way he had brought home a book from town because she had mentioned loving to read. The way he told her stories about the horses he trained, his face lighting up with enthusiasm. She was falling for Marcus Thorne, and she suspected he might be falling for her too, but neither of them spoke of it. The situation was too delicate, their arrangement too new and fragile to risk with romantic declarations. So they continued as they were, friends and partners, and if their hands lingered when they touched or their eyes met for a beat too long across the dinner table, neither of them acknowledged it out loud. Winter slowly loosened its grip on Montana, and the first signs of spring began to appear. The snow melted from the lower elevations, revealing brown grass and sleeping earth beneath. The days grew longer and slightly warmer, and Marcus's work at the ranch increased as the spring roundup approached. He was gone more often, sometimes for a full day at a time, and Rosa found herself missing him acutely when he was away. She had ventured into Hecla a few times, always with Marcus as escort, and the reception had been decidedly mixed. Some people, like the kindly doctor who checked her hands and pronounced her fully healed from the frostbite, were polite and professional. Others whispered behind their hands and looked at her with judgment in their eyes. Rosa held her head high and ignored them, but the disapproval stung nonetheless. The worst encounter came when she ran into Aunt Dorothy outside the general store. Her aunt had looked her up and down with cold eyes and said, "Living in sin with that cowboy, are you? I should have known you would end up a fallen woman. Your poor mother would be ashamed." Rosa had felt Marcus tense beside her, but she had put a hand on his arm to forestall his response. Instead, she had met her aunt's eyes and said clearly, "My mother would be ashamed that her sister stood by while her daughter tried to commit murder. Tell Margaret that I hope she sleeps well at night, because I certainly do." She had walked away then, leaving her aunt sputtering in the street, and Marcus had squeezed her hand in silent support. Later, when they were back at the cabin, he had said, "You did not have to defend me. I am used to gossip." "I was not defending you. I was defending us. What we have is not shameful or wrong, and I will not let bitter people make it into something dirty." "What do we have, Rosa?" The question had been asked softly, almost carefully, and Rosa had known that her answer mattered. "We have a partnership, a friendship. Something that is starting to feel like it could be more if we are brave enough to let it." Marcus had stepped closer then, close enough that she could see the gold flecks in his brown eyes. "I have been trying to be respectful, trying not to take advantage of the situation. But Rosa, you have to know that I have been feeling more than friendship for a while now. So have I. I do not have much to offer you. This cabin, a steady job, the promise that I will work hard every day to make you happy. But if that is enough, if I am enough, then I would like to court you properly, with the intention of making you my wife if you will have me." Rosa's heart had felt too big for her chest. "You want to marry me? Eventually, yes. I know it is fast, but Rosa, I have never felt this way about anyone before. You make me laugh. You make this cabin feel like a home instead of just a place to sleep. When I am out working, I find myself thinking about getting back to you, to hearing about your day and sharing a meal and just being in your presence. I am falling in love with you, and I do not want to hide it anymore." "I am falling in love with you too," Rosa had whispered. And then Marcus had cupped her face in his hands and kissed her, and the world had narrowed down to the warmth of his lips and the gentle strength of his arms around her. That had been 3 weeks ago, and since then, their relationship had blossomed into full courtship. Marcus was still sleeping on the floor, insisting that they maintain some propriety until they were married, but they spent their evenings talking and laughing and stealing kisses by the firelight. Marcus taught Rosa to ride his horse, laughing when she shrieked at the animal's first trot and beaming with pride when she eventually managed a full gallop across the meadow behind the cabin. Rosa taught Marcus to dance, humming waltzes her mother had loved while they spun around the small cabin floor. They made plans for the future. Marcus wanted to buy more land and build a bigger house eventually, one with a proper bedroom and a parlor and room for children. Rosa wanted a garden where she could grow vegetables and flowers, and Marcus promised to help her till and fence a plot as soon as the ground thawed completely. They talked about everything and nothing, learning each other's dreams and fears and hopes. It was not all easy. There were hard days when the weight of her parents' loss hit Rosa like a physical blow, and she would spend hours staring out the window, lost in grief. On those days, Marcus would hold her and let her cry, not trying to fix it or minimize it, just offering his steady presence. And there were times when Marcus grew frustrated with the limitations of his position, wishing he had more to give her than a humble cabin and a working man's wages. On those days, Rosa would remind him that she had grown up in a modest home with parents who had worked hard their whole lives, and she had been happy. Wealth was not what mattered. As spring truly arrived and the world turned green again, Marcus took Rosa to meet his uncle and see the Double T Ranch properly. Tom Thorne turned out to be a gruff but fair man in his 50s, with the same build as Marcus but hair gone gray at the temples. He looked Rosa over with shrewd eyes and then nodded once. "Heard about what happened with your relatives in town," he said bluntly. "Heard you have been keeping house for my nephew. I will not lie to you, girl. There is talk, and not all of it kind. But Marcus is a good man, and if he says you are good people, then that is enough for me. You are welcome at my table any time." "Thank you, sir," Rosa said, relieved. Tom's wife, Catherine, was warmer, immediately taking Rosa under her wing and showing her around the ranch house. She was a plump, cheerful woman who had raised 4 children on the ranch, and she clearly approved of Marcus's choice. "He has been alone too long," Catherine confided as she served Rosa tea in her spacious kitchen. "I've been trying to introduce him to suitable young ladies for 2 years now, but he never showed interest. Then suddenly he is telling us about you, and I could see the difference in him right away. That boy is smitten." "I am smitten too," Rosa admitted. "That is plain to anyone with eyes." "So when is the wedding?" "We have not set a date yet. We have only been courting for a few weeks." "But you have been living together for months. Seems to me you have done more courting than most people do in a year, just under unusual circumstances. Do not waste time on a long engagement, dear. Life is too short and uncertain, especially out here." Rosa took Catherine's words to heart, and that evening, as she and Marcus rode back to the cabin in the golden light of late afternoon, she brought up the subject. "Your aunt thinks we should get married soon." Aunt Catherine always was a woman of strong opinions. "Is that what you want?" "I think so. I know it is fast by conventional standards, but nothing about our situation has been conventional, and she is right that we have already been living as partners for months. Making it legal would just formalize what we already have." Marcus pulled his horse to a stop and turned to face her, his expression serious. "Rosa Kensington, I know I have not got a fancy ring or a perfect proposal planned, but I love you with everything I have. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Rosa felt tears prick her eyes, but they were happy tears this time. "Yes, Marcus Thorne, I would be honored to be your wife." They were married 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the small church in Hecla. Tom and Catherine served as witnesses, and about a dozen ranch hands and their families attended. Rosa wore her mother's best dress, which she had carefully altered to fit, and Marcus wore a new suit that represented a significant portion of his savings. The preacher was the same one who had presided over dozens of weddings in the rough mining town, and he kept the service short and to the point. When Marcus kissed her at the conclusion of the ceremony, Rosa felt like her heart would burst with happiness. All the pain and loss and fear of the past year seemed to fade into insignificance compared to this moment, this promise of a future with the man she loved. The reception was held at the ranch house, with Catherine providing a feast that would have done a much larger wedding proud. There was dancing and laughter and toasts to the happy couple. Rosa's only regret was that her parents were not there to see her married, but she felt their presence in spirit and knew they would have approved of Marcus. As the sun set and the party began to wind down, Marcus and Rosa rode back to their cabin, now truly their home. Marcus had spent the previous evening moving his things properly into the space and making sure everything was perfect for their wedding night. There were wildflowers on the table, and he had somehow acquired real linens for the bed. "You did not have to go to all this trouble," Rosa said, touched by the effort. "I wanted to. You deserve something special." That night they came together as husband and wife, and Rosa discovered a new dimension to the love they shared. Marcus was gentle and patient, making sure she felt safe and cherished, and Rosa gave herself to him freely, holding nothing back. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the bed, talking and laughing until sleep claimed them. The first year of their marriage was one of hard work and deep contentment. Marcus continued his work with the ranch horses, and his reputation as a skilled trainer grew. Ranchers from neighboring spreads began bringing their difficult horses to him, and the extra income allowed him to start saving for the land and house he had promised Rosa. Rosa transformed the cabin and its surroundings into a true home. She planted her garden, coaxing vegetables and flowers from the Montana soil with determination and her mother's old gardening wisdom. She also began taking in sewing work from some of the ranch wives, building a small business that gave her both purpose and pocket money. Catherine became a good friend, visiting often and teaching Rosa the ins and outs of frontier life. They made trips to town together, and gradually the gossip died down as people accepted them as a married couple. Rosa still avoided her aunt and uncle, and they made no effort to reach out to her, which suited her fine. Margaret married a miner's son that summer, and Rosa heard through Catherine that the marriage was reportedly as miserable as Margaret deserved. As fall arrived and the world turned gold and crimson, Rosa realized she had not had her monthly courses in some time. At first she attributed it to stress or the change of seasons, but when other symptoms appeared, she knew the truth. She was pregnant. She told Marcus one evening after dinner, watching his face anxiously for his reaction. He stared at her for a long moment, and then a smile broke across his face like sunrise. "A baby! We are going to have a baby." "Yes. I think I am about 3 months along, which means the baby should come in the spring." Marcus swept her into his arms, spinning her around the cabin despite her laughing protests that he would make her dizzy. "I am going to be a father. Rosa, this is the best news I could have imagined." "You are happy then?" "Happy. I am beyond happy. I am blessed. You have made me the luckiest man in Montana." The pregnancy progressed smoothly, though Rosa suffered from intense nausea in the early months and exhaustion throughout. Marcus hovered and fussed and drove her slightly crazy with his concern, but she loved him for it. He built a cradle from scratch, working on it in every spare moment, sanding and polishing the wood until it was smooth as silk. Catherine gave them baby clothes that her own children had worn, and Rosa spent her evenings sewing tiny garments while Marcus read aloud to her from books he borrowed from his aunt's surprisingly extensive library. As winter returned and the world turned white again, Rosa sometimes thought back to that terrible night a year ago when she had been locked out in the frost. It seemed like something that had happened to a different person in a different lifetime. That girl had been desperate and alone, with no prospects and no hope. Now she was Rosa Thorne, beloved wife and soon-to-be mother, surrounded by love and security. The transformation was almost miraculous. On a cold February evening, Rosa went into labor. Marcus rode through a snowstorm to fetch the midwife, a capable woman named Mrs. Henderson, who had delivered most of the babies in the county. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next day, but Marcus stayed by Rosa's side the entire time, holding her hand and murmuring encouragement even when she cursed him for getting her into this situation. Finally, As the afternoon sun slanted through the cabin window, their son was born. He came into the world screaming his displeasure at the indignity of birth, and Rosa fell instantly and completely in love. Marcus's face, when Mrs. Henderson placed the baby in his arms, was a picture of awe and wonder. "He is perfect," Marcus breathed. "Rosa, you made a perfect person." "We made him together," Rosa corrected, exhausted but happier than she had ever been. They named him Matthew, after Rosa's father, and he became the center of their world. Marcus proved to be a devoted father, walking the floor with Matthew when he was colicky, changing diapers without complaint, and singing surprisingly good lullabies in his deep voice. Rosa watched him with their son, and fell in love with him all over again. As Matthew grew from infant to baby to toddler, the Thorne household expanded in other ways as well. Marcus's horse training business continued to thrive, and he finally saved enough to buy the adjacent parcel of land he had been wanting. They began planning a larger house, and with help from Tom and the ranch hands, the structure began to take shape over the summer of 1886. The new house had 4 bedrooms, a proper parlor, a large kitchen, and even a small room that Marcus insisted on calling Rosa's sewing room. It was grander than anything Rosa had imagined living in, and she cried the day they moved in, overwhelmed by how much her life had changed in just over 2 years. "Happy tears, I hope," Marcus said, wrapping his arms around her as they stood in their new parlor. "The happiest," Rosa confirmed. "I was just thinking about how far we have come. 2 years ago, I was sleeping in a corner of my aunt's house, miserable and unwanted. Now I have this beautiful home and a husband I adore and a son who is the light of my life. It almost seems too good to be true. It is true, though. And it is going to keep getting better. I promise you that." Marcus kept his promise. Their life together continued to flourish. Rosa's sewing business expanded to the point where she had to turn down work, and she began teaching sewing to some of the younger women in the area, finding satisfaction in passing on her mother's skills. Marcus became the head horse trainer for the Double T, with several men working under him, and his reputation spread throughout the territory. They had 2 more children in the following years. A daughter they named Ruth, born in 1887, who had her mother's red hair and her father's easy smile. And another son, Robert, born in 1889, who was quiet and thoughtful from the day he entered the world. The house filled with the noise and chaos of childhood, and Rosa discovered that she loved being a mother even more than she had expected. As the years passed and the children grew, Rosa occasionally crossed paths with her aunt and uncle in town. They had aged poorly, Uncle Howard's drinking having taken its toll, and Margaret's marriage had ended in scandal when her husband was caught stealing from the mining company. They never spoke, those former relatives and Rosa, but sometimes she caught her aunt looking at her with something that might have been regret or envy in her eyes. Rosa felt nothing but pity for them. They had chosen bitterness and cruelty, and they were living with the consequences. In 1890, Montana became a state, and Hecla celebrated with a grand festival. The Thorne family attended together, Marcus and Rosa watching proudly as their children played games and ate sweets. As they stood together at the edge of the festivities, Marcus's arm around Rosa's waist, she reflected on the journey that had brought them here. "You ever wonder what your life would have been like if I had not ridden past that night?" Marcus asked, as if reading her thoughts. "I would have died," Rosa said simply. "There is no other outcome. If you had not found me, I would have frozen to death in the street. I am glad I found you then. Not just because I saved your life, but because you saved mine too, in a way. I was lonely before you came. I did not realize how lonely until I had you to come home to." "We saved each other," Rosa said, rising on her toes to kiss him. And we built something beautiful together. The children came running up then, demanding that their parents come watch the fireworks that were being prepared, and Marcus and Rosa allowed themselves to be pulled into the crowd. As the first explosion of light and color lit up the Montana sky, Rosa held her youngest son on her hip, her daughter's hand in her free hand, and leaned against her husband's solid strength. This was her family. This was her home. This was the life that had begun on a frozen winter night when a cowboy had broken down a door and taken home a stranger. Years continued to pass in the rhythms of ranch life and family. Matthew grew into a teenager with his father's height and his mother's determination, and he showed a natural aptitude for working with horses that made Marcus beam with pride. Ruth was clever and quick-witted, reading every book she could get her hands on and announcing at age 10 that she intended to become a teacher. Robert was the gentle soul of the family, more interested in drawing and music than ranching, and Rosa encouraged his artistic interests, even as Marcus scratched his head in bemused confusion at having a son who preferred a pencil to a rope. The cabin where Rosa and Marcus had first lived together was converted into a workshop where Marcus repaired saddles and other tack, and it became a place of special significance for them. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, they would walk down there together and sit on the porch, watching the sun set over the mountains and remembering those early days. "I was so scared back then," Rosa confessed one evening in 1895, as they sat together watching the sky turn pink and gold. "Not just the night you found me, but for weeks afterward. I kept waiting for something to go wrong, for you to realize you had made a mistake taking me in." "I never thought that," Marcus said, lacing his fingers through hers. "Not even for a moment. From the first time I saw you standing there in my coat, too big and wrapped in blankets, I knew you were something special. Frozen half to death and probably looking like a drowned rat," Rosa laughed. "Beautiful," Marcus corrected. "Brave and beautiful, and exactly what I did not know I was looking for." They had weathered challenges over the years, of course. There had been a terrible winter in 1891 when they lost half their livestock, and money had been desperately tight for months. Marcus had injured his leg badly in 1893 when a horse threw him, and he had been laid up for weeks while Rosa had taken over many of his duties in addition to her own. There had been childhood illnesses that terrified them both, and arguments about money and child rearing, and all the other things couples argued about. But through it all, the foundation of love and respect they had built sustained them. Tom Thorne retired in 1897, turning over full management of the Double T to Marcus, who had been serving as unofficial manager for several years anyway. It was a moment of great pride for Marcus, and a testament to how far he had come from the disillusioned young man who had left Kansas all those years ago. He proved to be a fair and capable manager, well liked by the ranch hands and respected throughout the territory. Rosa, meanwhile, had become a pillar of the community in her own right. Her sewing school had evolved into a sort of informal women's cooperative, where she and several other women shared skills, supported each other's businesses, and provided assistance to women in difficult situations. When a young widow with 3 children found herself destitute after her husband was killed in a mining accident, it was Rosa who organized the community response, finding the woman work and housing. When a woman appeared in Hecla with suspicious bruises and a frightened demeanor, it was to Rosa that she turned, and Rosa who helped her escape an abusive marriage and start a new life in another town. "You have become the person you needed when you first arrived here," Marcus observed one day, watching Rosa organize a fundraiser for a family whose home had burned down. Rosa paused, considering his words, and then nodded slowly. I suppose I have. I remember how alone I felt, how helpless. If I can spare other women that feeling, then all the pain I went through means something. As the new century approached, the Thorne family had become one of the most respected in the region. Matthew, now 20, was being courted by several local families with marriageable daughters, much to his embarrassment and his parents' amusement. Ruth had indeed become a teacher, running the schoolhouse in Hecla with warmth and competence. Robert, at 18, had surprised everyone by announcing his intention to study architecture in Denver, his sketches and designs having impressed a visiting architect who offered to take him on as an apprentice. On New Year's Eve of 1899, as the 19th century prepared to give way to the 20th, Rosa and Marcus hosted a party at their home for family and friends. The house was full of laughter and music, children running underfoot while adults danced and reminisced. At midnight, as everyone counted down to the new century, Marcus pulled Rosa aside onto the front porch, away from the noise and celebration. 20 years, he said, looking down at her in the lamplight that spilled from the windows. 20 years since I found you in the snow. Sometimes it feels like yesterday, and sometimes it feels like you have been in my life forever. It has been a good 20 years, Rosa said, resting her head against his chest. We have built something remarkable, Marcus. Not just this house or the ranch, but our family, our place in this community. I am so proud of what we have accomplished together. I could not have done any of it without you. You are my partner in every sense of the word, Rosa Thorne. My best friend, the love of my life, the mother of my children. You are everything to me. They kissed as the century turned, and Rosa felt the same flutter in her heart that she had felt on their wedding night, on the night Marcus first kissed her, on the night he broke down a door to save her life. Some things, she thought, never changed. Love was one of them. The early years of the 20th century brought continued prosperity and happiness to the Thorne family. Matthew married a sweet girl named Sarah from a neighboring ranch, and they built a house on Thorne land, Matthew taking over more and more of the ranch operations as Marcus began to slow down slightly. Their first grandchild, a boy named Thomas after his great-great-uncle, was born in 1902, and Rosa discovered that being a grandmother was even more wonderful than she had anticipated. Ruth married a young lawyer who had set up practice in Hecla, and they remained in town, giving Rosa the joy of having both her daughter and grandson nearby. Robert thrived in Denver, becoming a successful architect and returning home several times a year with fantastic stories of city life and modern innovations like electric lights and automobiles. As Rosa entered her 40s and then her 50s, she sometimes looked at her reflection and saw her mother's face looking back at her. She had aged well, with laugh lines around her eyes and silver threading through her red hair, and Marcus insisted she was more beautiful than ever. He had aged too, his dark hair going gray at the temples and then fully silver, his face weathering into distinguished lines, but he was still strong and capable, still the man who had swept her off her feet all those years ago. They took to spending long evenings on the porch of the big house, watching the sun set over the mountains and talking about everything and nothing. Sometimes grandchildren would join them, climbing into their laps for stories about the old days. Rosa told them carefully edited versions of how she and Marcus met, leaving out the worst details of her aunt's cruelty, but keeping the essential romance of a cowboy rescuing a woman in distress. Grandfather broke down the door, young Thomas asked, wide-eyed, when he was about 6 years old. He did indeed, Rosa confirmed. One strong shoulder and the door flew right open. Was it scary? The boy asked. Being locked out was terrifying, Rosa said honestly. But your grandfather was not scary at all. He was kind and gentle, and he made me feel safe from the very first moment. Marcus, who was listening to this conversation with a smile, added, "Your grandmother was the bravest person I had ever met. She had been through something terrible, but she did not let it break her. She built a whole new life, and she made my life better in every way." In 1910, Uncle Howard died, having drunk himself into an early grave. Rosa attended the funeral out of courtesy, but felt no real grief. Aunt Dorothy had preceded him by 2 years, and Margaret had moved away. No one quite knew where. The house where Rosa had once lived as an unwanted dependent stood empty for a while, before being bought by a young family new to Hecla. Rosa walked past it sometimes, and felt nothing but gratitude that her life had taken a different path. The ranch continued to thrive under Marcus and Matthew's joint management, adapting to the changing times as automobiles began to supplement horses and modern ranching techniques were introduced. Marcus was slower to embrace change than his son, but he trusted Matthew's judgment and allowed innovation where it made sense. Rosa's Women's Cooperative had expanded to include a small lending library and regular meetings where women discussed everything from recipes to politics, and Rosa was immensely proud of what they had built. As they entered their 60s, Rosa and Marcus began to talk more seriously about their legacy and what they wanted to leave behind. They established a scholarship fund for young women seeking education, in memory of Rosa's mother and the opportunities Rosa herself had been denied. They ensured that each of their children was provided for, and that the ranch would remain in family hands for generations to come. They also made generous donations to the church and to various charitable causes around Hecla, wanting to give back to the community that had ultimately accepted them. In the summer of 1915, they decided to take a trip back to Kansas so that Marcus could visit his childhood home one last time. His father had died years earlier, but Marcus had never made peace with that relationship, and it weighed on him. They traveled by train, a far cry from the days when such a journey would have taken weeks by wagon, and found Kansas much changed from Marcus's memories. The store his father had run was now owned by someone else, and the town had grown significantly. Marcus walked the streets of his childhood with Rosa by his side, pointing out places that had meaning to him. They visited his father's grave, and Marcus stood there for a long time in silence before finally speaking. "I am sorry we never understood each other," he said to the headstone. "I am sorry I could not be the son you wanted, but I am not sorry for the life I chose. It brought me Rosa and my children and a happiness I could not have imagined. I hope, wherever you are, you have found some peace with that." Rosa slipped her hand into his, and they stood together in the Kansas sunshine, two people bound by decades of love and shared experience. When they returned to Montana a week later, Marcus seemed lighter, as if laying that old ghost to rest had freed something in him. The years continued their steady march. Great-grandchildren arrived, and the Thorne family tree grew branches and leaves. Rosa taught her granddaughters to sew, passing down her mother's skills one more generation. Marcus taught his grandsons about horses and honor and treating people with respect. They watched the world change around them, marveling at innovations like airplanes and radio, shaking their heads at the horrors of the Great War in Europe, and holding tight to each other and their family through it all. In 1920, as Rosa approached her 60th birthday and Marcus his 63rd, they decided to host a grand party to celebrate their anniversary. It would be 35 years since that cold January night when Marcus had broken down a door and changed both their lives forever. The celebration was held at the ranch, with the entire family in attendance, along with friends from all over Montana and beyond. As the evening drew to a close and the last guests departed, Rosa and Marcus found themselves alone on the porch of the house he had built for her so many years ago. The stars were brilliant overhead, and the air was crisp with the promise of winter, though nothing like the deadly cold of that long-ago night. 35 years, Rosa mused, leaning against Marcus's shoulder. More than half my life spent with you. I cannot even remember what it was like before. Cold and lonely, Marcus said. That is what it was like before. You brought warmth and light and love into my life, Rosa. You still do every single day. We have been blessed, Rosa said softly. I know not everyone gets a love like ours. Not everyone gets rescued by a cowboy who breaks down doors and takes them home and gives them a whole new life. I did not give you a new life. You built it yourself. I just gave you a chance. You gave me everything, Rosa corrected. And I would do it all again in a heartbeat, even the scary parts, if I knew it would lead me back to you. They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the night sounds of the ranch and feeling the deep contentment that comes from a life well lived. Inside the house, their children and grandchildren were settling in for the night, filling the bedrooms with laughter and love. Tomorrow there would be a big breakfast and more celebration. But for now, it was just the two of them, as it had been in the beginning. I love you, Rosa Thorne, Marcus said, the words as true and heartfelt as the first time he had spoken them more than 3 decades earlier. I love you too, Marcus Thorne, Rosa replied. Thank you for saving me. Thank you for loving me. Thank you for this beautiful life. They kissed under the Montana stars, two people who had found each other in the darkest moment and built something bright and lasting and true. The years would continue to pass, bringing joy and sorrow, triumph and challenge, as years always do. But whatever came, they would face it together, as they had faced everything since that frozen January night when a locked door was broken down, and two souls found their way home to each other. The story of Rosa and Marcus Thorne would be told and retold in their family for generations to come, a testament to the power of compassion, the strength of love, and the truth that sometimes salvation comes in the form of a stranger on horseback, willing to break down a door and change the course of a life forever. It was a story that began in frost and desperation, but bloomed into warmth and hope, and a love that transcended time. As the decades passed, and the 20th century unfolded with all its changes and challenges, the Thorne Ranch remained a constant, a place where family gathered and love was celebrated. Rosa and Marcus lived to see their great-great-grandchildren, tiny hands reaching up to touch weathered faces, and hear the stories of the old days when Montana was still wild, and life was hard but full of possibility. They never forgot that cold night, though the details became softer with time, wrapped in the gauze of memory. It became their creation story, the moment when everything changed, when cruelty and chance and one man's decent heart had collided to create something beautiful. Rosa would sometimes touch the faint scars on her fingertips, barely visible reminders of frostbite, and remember how close she had come to losing everything before she ever had a chance to find it. Marcus passed away peacefully in his sleep in 1932, at the age of 75, with Rosa holding his hand. His last words to her were, "I love you," the same words he had spoken countless times throughout their 47 years of marriage. Rosa grieved deeply but not desperately, knowing that they had been blessed with far more time than many couples received. She lived another 8 years, spending her final decade surrounded by the family they had created, the legacy they had built. When Rosa died in 1940, at the age of 77, she was laid to rest beside Marcus in the cemetery overlooking Hecla. The town they had helped build had grown and prospered, and the ranch they had nurtured was now run by Matthew's son, the third generation of Thornes to work that land. At Rosa's funeral, her granddaughter Ruth, named for her teacher aunt, stood and told the story of how her grandmother had been locked out in the frost by cruel relatives, and how her grandfather had broken down a door and taken her home. They built a life on compassion and courage, Ruth told the gathered crowd. Grandmother could have become bitter after what she endured, but instead she became the kindest person I ever knew. Grandfather could have ridden past that night, but instead he stopped to help a stranger. Together, they showed us all what love looks like when it is real and lasting and true. They showed us that family is not just about blood, but about choosing to care for each other even when it is hard. That is their legacy, and it is one we should all aspire to. The assembled mourners nodded in agreement, many of them wiping away tears. The story of Rosa and Marcus Thorne had become legend in Hecla, a reminder that even in the hardest times, hope and love could prevail. Years later, when the old Thorne house was renovated, a great-grandchild found a journal that Rosa had kept during those early years in Montana. The entries were sparse at first, written in the careful hand of someone conserving paper and ink. But they told the story in Rosa's own words, and several entries stood out. February 15, 1884. I am alive. This morning I woke in a warm bed in a safe place, and that is more than I dared hope for just days ago. Marcus asks for nothing but allows me everything. I do not understand yet why he saved me, but I am grateful beyond words. March 22, 1884. I am learning that kindness exists in this world, though my family tried to convince me otherwise. Marcus treats me with a respect I have never known from any man. We are becoming friends, I think. Perhaps even more than friends, though it is too soon to say for certain. April 30, 1884. I am in love. I did not mean for it to happen, tried to guard my heart against it, but Marcus Thorne has won me completely. He is everything I did not know I was looking for. Tomorrow I will tell him how I feel and hope that he feels the same. June 10, 1885. We were married today. Mrs. Rosa Thorne. I keep writing it over and over, hardly believing it is real. 1 year ago I was locked out in the cold, certain I would die. Now I am married to the man who saved my life and stole my heart. If my parents can see me from heaven, I hope they know I am happy. I hope they know I found love in the most unlikely place. The journal went on to document the births of their children, the building of their home, the small triumphs and challenges of daily life. But woven through it all was a constant thread of love and gratitude, Rosa's repeated wonder at how her life had transformed from desperate to blessed. The final entry, dated just a month before Rosa's death, reads simply, I am an old woman now, and my Marcus has been gone for 8 years. I miss him every day, but I am not sad. We had 47 years together, and they were good years, full of love and laughter and the family we built together. When I close my eyes, I can still see him as he was that night, strong and sure, breaking down the door that stood between me and life. He gave me everything. He gave me a home, a family, a purpose, and a love that sustained me through every challenge. I am ready now to join him, to tell him one more time how grateful I am, how much I loved him, how perfect our life together was. This is not an ending but a continuation of the story we began on that cold January night so long ago. I am going home to him, and my heart is at peace. The journal became a treasured family heirloom, passed down through generations as a reminder of where the Thorne family had come from and the values that had built their legacy. The story of Rosa and Marcus was told at family gatherings, adapted into different forms as the years passed. but always maintaining its essential truth. That love could bloom in the darkest circumstances, that compassion could change lives, and that sometimes the bravest thing you could do was break down a door and offer shelter to someone who needed it. The old cabin where Rosa and Marcus first lived together still stood on the Thorne Ranch well into the 21st century, carefully preserved as a historical site. Visitors could see the simple space where a cowboy and a rescued woman had fallen in love, where they had built the foundation for a family that would span generations. There was a plaque on the wall telling their story, and every year on the anniversary of that cold January night in 1884, the Thorne family gathered there to remember their ancestors and the love story that had started it all. And so the tale lived on, a piece of Montana history and a testament to the enduring power of human decency and love. Rosa and Marcus Thorne became the standard against which their descendants measured their own relationships, a reminder that true love was not just about passion or romance, but about choosing each other every day, building something together, and facing the world as partners. From a moment of cruelty and desperation had come a love story for the ages, and from that love had come a family, a legacy, and a lesson that would echo through time. That we are all called to be the person who breaks down the door, who extends a hand to those in need, who chooses compassion over convenience. Marcus had done that for Rosa, and in return, she had given him a life richer than he could have imagined. Together, they had proven that even in the harsh wilderness of the Old West, even in the depths of winter, love could not only survive but thrive, growing stronger with every passing year until it became something eternal, something that death itself could not diminish. Their story was complete, a full circle from that frozen night to peaceful endings, from desperation to contentment, from strangers to soulmates. It was a story of the American West, of survival and perseverance, but more than that, it was a story of two hearts finding each other against all odds and building something beautiful that would last far beyond their own lifetimes. It was, in the end, a story of home, how Marcus had given Rosa a physical home when she had none, and how together they had created a home in the truest sense, a place of love, safety, and belonging that would shelter generations to come.